Hey guys, welcome to Screen Ross. This is my reaction video to Avatar Fire and Ash. I literally saw it this morning, saw it about 2 hours ago. So this is my initial reaction, still fresh in my mind. Thought I'd log on, record a quick video, talk about what I thought of the film, what I liked, what I didn't, how it compared to the other films. I'm going to try and stay away from spoilers. Maybe towards the end I might do specifics, maybe do a few spoilers then, but I'll give you loads of warning before I do that. So let's jump into it. So yeah, a bit of background. I generally like the Avatar films. Really liked the first one, really liked the second one, although I feel the first one is probably my preferred. I feel like the first one feels like a complete film. And the second one, I was always a little bit unsure of. Like, there was parts of it that I felt like it was a good film, had a good story, but there was always just something missing. And I think actually now I've seen Fire and Ash, I kind of know why. So Avatar Fire and Ash really plays like a part two to The Way of Water. And when you look at The Way of Water in hindsight, I think that's really where my problems were coming from. It didn't really feel like it had a conclusive ending. It was setting up story threads that didn't feel like they'd been paid off. So although it had its own narrative within the context of the film, it always felt a bit wanting. The climax of the film, although very intense and action-packed, didn't quite feel like a conclusion overall to the film itself or the story in large. And I feel like Fire and Ash really is that culmination. So as well as playing as almost a part two to The Way of Water, it does actually feel like a conclusion to the Avatar trilogy in general, because there are elements from the first film that also get picked up again in the third one. So you've got elements of the first and second that all sort of combine and conclude into the third film. So yeah, I really like the third film. It goes without saying, obviously, the special effects, the imagery, the action sequences are all phenomenal, out of this world. Some of the best you've ever seen. So from that perspective, absolutely great. But also some of the things that Avatar usually gets picked up on is the story, especially the first film. You know, the story, although it had some pretty high concepts in it, the actual narrative and the story was pretty straightforward. And I completely get why. You're introducing sort of like mass audiences to a fairly high concept film, aliens, a different planet, avatars, people going in, minds being put into the avatars of the Na'vi's body. I get why you'd want a simple sort of throughput story to take that through. Whereas I feel like the third film, Fire and Ash, because it plays a little bit differently to the second film, and that it feels much more of a continuation and a culmination of that film. There's actually quite a few new and interesting story beats in the films with the family dynamics, the what else is going on in the world from the sort of the corporate and the human perspectives. We get introduced to different Na'vi tribes, which obviously you've all seen in the trailers, which are the Ash people. It just felt like there was much more of a through line, and the story had a focus of where it wanted to go. So in that regard, I kind of feel like part three, although there are some similar beats, especially in the final act, it does play a bit differently to the first two films in that it sort of, rather than re-establishing the world, which I feel like both parts 1 and 2 did to like reintroduce you to everything, this one really is story focused and Pandora just happens to be in the background. It's different. It's very different in that obviously there's visual elements that are very similar. Obviously they're in the water areas, there's the flying mountains and all this stuff. But there's less of the story of let's get introduced to a new tribe, let's learn their ways, and then let's have a battle at the end, which is essentially what happens in the first two films. This is much more, okay, the story's been established, these are the stakes, this is what we now need to do to survive, essentially. So I guess there's an element of a chase movie, back and forth across Pandora, which you'll see when you see it. But as a result, I feel like the story feel like it was progressing, as opposed to, oh, let's stop and train and learn the ways of the people for a while. So yeah, overall, great film. Really enjoyed it. Amazing special effects. One of the things that I did want to touch on was the high frame rate. So I actually saw the film in 2D rather than 3D. And I had heard that a high frame rate was being used in 3D showings to help with the 3D working. So I was a little bit surprised that my 2D screening was also in high frame rate. Well, partially. So it was a little bit weird. So some scenes played out in high frame rate, which is 48 frames per second, which makes everything feel smoother. But sometimes, if you're watching cinema, it almost feels unrealistically smooth to a certain extent, and things almost look like they're moving a little too fast. It's a little too polished, and it can sometimes be a bit distracting, as opposed to the standard 24 frames per second that you would see in most traditional films. The weird thing here, though, is that it's kind of variable. So some scenes are in high frame rate and then they run super smooth, and then the other frames are in the more standard 24 frames per second and they look more like you'd expect a traditional film to look. And when the film first started, the opening sequence seems to all be in high frame rate, super smooth, and I was quite distracted, and I almost a little bit, I was like, oh. I remember seeing the Hobbit in high frame rate, and I was a little bit like, oh no, is the whole film going to be like this? But then, I don't know, a few minutes in, there was a couple of shots where I was like, oh, that looks like it's now running in 24 frames per second. And then I thought, oh, okay, so maybe what we're going to be doing, we're going to have high frame rates for some of the high action, big landscape shots where actually high frame rate works quite well. And then we're going to have 24 frames per second for the more quieter, low motion, talky, quiet scenes. But then that doesn't really happen either. And I couldn't quite work out what the rule was for when not because it wasn't even a scene, it was almost done on a shot by shot basis. So you could have people talking in a scene, it cuts to one character and it's playing in 24 frames per second. Then it will cut to the other character and it's playing in 48 frames per second. And I couldn't quite see why. And it actually became quite distracting at some points. When you had the big shots of like the creatures and people flying through the sky or swimming through the water and it was in the high frame rate, it actually looked awesome. It all looked really smooth, super clear and detailed. And then that made perfect sense why you would choose it for a shot like that. But when you've got two people talking and you just use it for one person and not the other, and sometimes not even for that person, sometimes for a specific angle. And sometimes it wasn't even like that camera shot was actually moving or had any real dynamic movement in it to justify the high frame rate. So I'm not really sure why that was done. I mean, I would have probably preferred to seen it all in high frame rate or all in 24 frames per second. I mean, obviously when it gets released on Disney Plus and Blu-ray, you probably will just be in the standard 24 frames per second. But it was a little bit distracting because it just wasn't consistent in the use. I mean, obviously James Cameron, hugely into tech, he's obviously developed all this technology to make these films. So I would love to know the rationale for what shots deserved high frame rate and which ones didn't, and why the choices were made. What else can I say? I've seen stuff online from some of the early reviews, people saying that, oh, they're bored of it, like the novelty of Pandora is worn off, there's nothing new in this film, it's just all the same, it feels like a remake of the first and the second ones. And in some instances I can kind of see where people are coming from. There are some shots which are almost exactly the same as in the first or the second ones. Definitely some of the underwater sequences with at the start when some of the kids are messing around jumping off the back of the big whale creatures. There are some shots in there that are literally almost like for like the same. So I get that, but at the same time, it's kind of like, well, of course it feels the same. You know, we're back on Pandora, we're in the same locations. I mean, if you were looking at just a regular film, you wouldn't necessarily go, oh, it's filmed in New York again. I've seen New York again. So we're almost going to discredit the film because, oh, I've seen New York, Manhattan in a film before, so this film's not good. But actually, I didn't actually find it too bad. I mean, yeah, obviously, there are sequences where they're at the water village. There's sequences back in the floating mountains. But there's also new places. You've got swamplands, you've got jungles, you've got deserts, you've got mountains. You know, there's a lot of fire. There's actually some big sequences which are built around the big industrial human bases. And actually that does feel completely new because although they've been in the films before, we've never really spent a prolonged amount of time there and had a lot of action sequences in those places. So that actually did feel quite unique and original. The one thing I would say though, in terms of the novelty and things being very similar to been there, done that type thing, is probably the final act. So the final sequence, like the big, I mean, it's not really a spoil to say the film ends with a big climatic battle with the Na'vi versus the humans. It's in the trailers. It's kind of expected. So yeah, I really felt like the final sequence was really a mishmash of the first and second film really being pulled together. You had the big flying action sequence, you had the stuff under the water, you had the same mechs. Don't get me wrong, it all looked incredible. It was amazing. It just felt a bit like if you put in both of those sequences and merged them together and took the greatest hits, that's essentially the big action sequence you get at the end of Avatar Fire and Ash. Looked great, but that was my only one when I could see the comments of like, oh yeah, I've seen all this before, where I was like, yeah, this final sequence does feel a bit like that. So final kind of thoughts really. Felt like Jake was actually much bigger part of this film. I felt like in The Way of Water, he definitely got sidelined. It seemed his son Loak became the sort of the central character in that film. This is actually a bit weird because that film obviously opens being narrated by Jake, and then Jake isn't, I mean, he's still in it quite a bit, obviously, but it kind of feels like the focus is on Loak or equally on Loak. Whereas in the third film, the narration is done by Loak, but it's almost the reverse because I would say Jake is actually in this film the most. He is the main character, and Loak is in it again quite a lot, but just not as much as Jake. So I thought that was an interesting choice that the character that narrates the film in parts 1 and part 3 isn't actually the character who is the central hero, as it were. Not necessarily going to get into spoilers. There were a couple of sequences that I actually thought were quite dark, quite adult and quite mature. More on a, not on a scary or inappropriate way, but more on a, from the perspective of, you know, that the topics that the characters are dealing with, you know, grief, racism, and even the darker elements of family and beliefs in some quite heart-wrenching moments. I was like, ooh, this was for an Avatar film, which is all about spectacle. I felt like on an emotional level, like we've really going quite deep here, and actually quite dark. So that was surprising. And like I say, I feel like maybe when I was saying earlier about how I felt the first two were quite straightforward, I feel like these were the sequences in part 3 where I was like, wow, I can't believe we're actually talking about or actually dedicating time to this sort of stuff in what is essentially a big blockbuster movie. What have I got? Any other thoughts? Of course, I also need to talk about the Ash clan. They're obviously the main new thing in Avatar Fire and Ash. Headed up by Farang, who is almost the evil Natiri. What can I say? They were awesome. She was really dark, really evil. Some of the stuff they do, which is the equivalent of scalping, I thought, whoa, that is pretty dark. Especially considering what it symbolizes in the Avatar films. The performance from her was incredible. Her and Quaritch definitely make a very evil couple. Again, almost the complete opposite of the Jake and Natiri couple. I would say though, she's not actually in the film as much as I would have thought. She's obviously makes a big presence, probably about 30-45 minutes in, and definitely in the second act. She's a big part of the second act, but she doesn't have a huge amount to do in the sort of the final third of the film. She kind of disappears without a trace, really. And when the film does end, there's no real mention of her. So I guess if there is an Avatar 4, I imagine she will be back in that, of course, and she will probably play a much bigger part in that film. But yeah, she was great. And on that front as well, I think Natiri, from the good side, as it were, like the performances there, again, incredible. Some of the stuff they talk about, quite dark, grown-up themes, like the acting is really good. So that was all top notch as well. So yeah, definitely something to watch the film for, just the performances in general. I guess final ranking wise, where would I say? I'm not sure. I've only seen it once. I've seen the first two multiple times. I'm probably leaning towards, definitely. I mean, at moments when I was watching the film, I would say it was actually probably my favorite of the three. However, there are some of the, the novel elements of the spectacle obviously are no longer there, even though some of the sequences look absolutely incredible. So at the moment, I mean, so I've seen some of the reviews saying it's the worst rated of the films. Definitely don't agree with that. It's definitely on par with the first two, maybe even better than the second one, because I feel what lacked in the second film, where it didn't really feel like it had a satisfying conclusion, or I felt something was missing, I definitely feel the third film acts more as a culmination of the trilogy. Saying that though, there are characters and some loose ends at the end that haven't been tied up. Once the final battle is over, I think there's literally a couple of scenes and then the film ends. And so it does feel a little bit like, for an epic saga, an epic conclusion, has it really completed? So I guess we'll see if there's a part 4 and 5. I'm sure this is going to make a huge amount of money. I guess it's if it makes enough money to justify making a sequel or 2 sequels. I hope they do. I love the world of Avatar and Pandora. Be good to see a completely different story in the world. Like I say, this part 1 and 2, 3 could almost be just one 6-hour-long film. So it'd be good to see a new narrative in Pandora. So yeah, I think if I've got any other thoughts, maybe I'll do a second video or something like that. But yeah, really interested to see what everyone else thinks. If you've got any comments, obviously comment below. And yeah, starting this relatively soon. So if you like what I'm saying, you like my perspective on these things, don't forget to like and subscribe. That'd be really helpful. But thanks again.